Late in the afternoon, the golden sunlight filtered through the large glass windows of the bank, casting a somber glow over the room. Walter Thompson, 75 years old, stepped inside with a weary gait. His old but carefully ironed clothes, a well-worn wooden cane in his hand, and a small bag slung over his shoulder seemed to carry every ounce of hope he had left. He approached the teller's counter with a faint but polite smile. "Excuse me, I need to withdraw some money to buy medicine for my wife," he said, his voice raspy with age, but imbued with sincerity. The bank employee gave him a quick, indifferent glance before looking away. "Have you updated your digital verification?" came the cold response from the teller, stopping Walter in his tracks. I don't know how to use a smartphone," he stammered, his hands trembling as he rummaged through his bag. He pulled out a stack of old documents, utility bills, a veteran ID card, and a faded black and white photograph. He thought these papers would prove who he was, but all he received was a dispassionate shake of the head. "We cannot process your request without completed digital verification. Policy is policy," the teller said, her voice as rigid as the words written in the rules. Walter's eyes filled with tears as he glanced at the prescription slip in his hand. The medication cost $486, and the pharmacy would close in less than 2 hours. "Please, I've saved my whole life and trusted this bank with my money. I only need a small amount to save my wife." His voice cracked, thick with emotion. But his plea was met with nothing but cold indifference. 2 security guards appeared without hesitation, instructing Walter to leave. Bowing his head in silence, he knelt down to pick up the scattered papers from the floor. His frail, trembling hands struggled with each piece, as if each one symbolized a fragment of his life, now discarded without care. Outside the bank, Walter sank onto a bench, his frail shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. The fading sunlight cast long shadows, leaving him enveloped in the encroaching darkness of despair. As people hurried past, Walter seemed like a forgotten part of the world, his glimmer of hope extinguishing with every passing moment. As Walter sat quietly, overwhelmed by his helplessness, a sleek black SUV pulled up in front of the bank. The car door opened, and out stepped Shaquille O'Neal, towering, strong, yet with a heart as big as his frame. Beside him was his teenage daughter, Miara, clutching her school books. They were chatting and laughing, blissfully unaware of the story unfolding just a few steps away. "Dad, look," Miara whispered, tugging at Shaq's sleeve and pointing toward the bench. Her gaze fell upon the elderly man, his head bowed, shoulders trembling. Scattered around him were crumpled utility bills, a worn prescription slip, and a faded photograph. Shaq paused, concern flashing across his face. He walked toward the man, his imposing figure casting a shadow over the bench. But as he crouched down, his voice softened, carrying a warmth that seemed to cut through the sadness. "Sir, are you all right?" Shaq asked, his deep voice kind and genuine. Walter looked up, his tear-filled eyes meeting Shaq's. For a moment, he seemed startled by the presence of the towering man. Famous, larger than life, yet whose gaze held nothing but understanding and compassion. I don't want to bother you," Walter murmured, trying to hide his pain. But under Shaq's gentle persistence, the dam of his emotions broke, and the words poured out. "My wife, she needs her medicine. She's fighting cancer, and they wouldn't let me withdraw my money because I don't have a smartphone. They threw me out like I was nothing," Walter said, his voice trembling as fresh tears streamed down his face. "My wife needs her medication. She's battling cancer, and they refuse to let me withdraw my own money because I don't have a smartphone. They threw me out, as if I'm nothing," Walter said, his voice trembling, tears streaming down his weathered face. At some point, Miara had quietly sat down next to Walter. She was carefully picking up the scattered papers, stacking them neatly in her small hands. "Dad, he's Coach Thompson," Miara exclaimed, her voice filled with astonishment. "I've heard about him at basketball camp. His team won the state championship. He helped so many underprivileged kids. Shaq tilted his head slightly, as if trying to piece together a memory. Stories of those who had been touched by Walter's kindness suddenly came flooding back. A coach who didn't just teach basketball, but also taught life lessons. A man who created opportunities for kids who had nothing, giving them a chance to step into the world with hope and confidence. "It's you, isn't it?" Shaq asked, his eyes filled with admiration and a trace of sorrow. Walter simply nodded, as if reluctant to let his past accomplishments overshadow the harsh reality he was facing now. "All of that, it doesn't matter anymore. I just want to save my wife." Walter's words hit Shaq like a punch to the gut. He stood silent for a moment, his gaze dropping to the crumpled prescription slip in Walter's hand. Then, without hesitation, Shaq leaned forward, gripping Walter's frail hand. "We're not going to let this end like this, sir," Shaq said, his voice firm yet comforting. "Let me help you." Miara clutched the old papers tightly as if they were precious treasures, while Shaq helped Walter to his feet. The three of them, united by an unspoken resolve, made their way toward the bank's glass doors. Inside, customers began to notice, their curious gazes mingling with a hint of hope. A new story was about to unfold, not just about an elderly man, but about kindness, justice, and the power of small, yet meaningful actions. As the bank's automatic doors slid open, the atmosphere inside seemed to shift. Shaq, his towering frame commanding the room, entered alongside Walter and Miara. Every pair of eyes turned toward them, and a tense silence enveloped the space. A few customers discreetly pulled out their phones, recording the rare and powerful scene. Lisa Reynolds, the bank manager, had just stepped out of her office after a long meeting. She looked up and immediately recognized Shaquille O'Neal, a figure who needed no introduction. But her gaze quickly shifted to Walter, whose weary face now carried a flicker of hope. Lisa instantly understood that this situation was going to be far from simple. Shaq didn't speak right away. He surveyed the room, his intense gaze moving from Lisa to the bank employees and customers, as if ensuring everyone would understand what was about to unfold. "Ma'am," Shaq finally said, his voice calm but resonant, "I believe we have something important to discuss." Lisa took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "How can I assist you, Mr. O'Neal?" she asked, her tone professional but with a slight quiver betraying her nerves. Shaq stepped forward, positioning himself protectively between Lisa and Walter. "Let me ask you this," he began, his voice steady and deliberate. "A man who has been banking here for over 4 decades, never a missed payment, never an overdraft. Doesn't he have the right to withdraw his own money?" Even though Shaq's tone remained composed, the weight of his words made the entire room hold its breath. Lisa hesitated, her gaze flickering between Shaq and Walter. Lisa hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. "Mr. O'Neal, this isn't personal. We're simply following bank policy. If he hasn't completed the digital verification process, we cannot process his transaction," she said, her voice turning cold as if to mask her inner turmoil. Shaq furrowed his brow, his eyes betraying a deep sense of disappointment. "Policy? You're calling this a policy?" he asked, pointing toward Walter, who stood there with his wooden cane trembling in his grasp. "Do you think this is protecting him, or is it just hurting him even more?" Lisa tried to maintain her composure, but the weight of the situation was palpable. She could feel the eyes of the surrounding customers, some whispering disapproval, their murmurs pressing against her confidence. "I understand this is a difficult situation," she said, her voice softer now. "But I can't break bank policy." Shaq took a step closer, his imposing frame almost towering over her, but his voice softened. "I know you're just doing your job, but your job isn't just about following policies. It's about serving people. He's not just a number in the system. He's a husband, a father, a man who's dedicated his life to this community." Lisa looked down, her hand gripping a pen tightly as if to steady herself. Shaq's voice dropped, filled with emotion. I lost my sister to cancer, and I had to fight this same system, not because we didn't have the money, but because of soulless policies. I know what it feels like to watch precious time slip away, powerless to do anything. And I'm not going to stand here and let Mr. Walter go through the same thing. The room fell into a heavy silence. Some customers wiped away tears, moved by Shaq's words. Walter stood quietly, his eyes fixed on Shaq with gratitude etched deep in his expression. Lisa lifted her gaze, torn between Shaq and Walter. But if I break the rules, I could lose my job, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Shaq's gaze softened, filled with understanding. You might lose a job, but you'll keep something far more important, your integrity and the respect of everyone here. Remember, today isn't just about Mr. Walter. It's about how you want to be remembered. Shaq's words struck a chord deep within Lisa. She glanced around the room, meeting the expectant eyes of those watching, not judging her, but waiting, hopeful. A spark lit within her. She realized that if she did nothing, she would carry this regret forever. Lisa sat down at her computer, her hands trembling slightly as she typed. There's an emergency override protocol, she said, her voice clearer now. I'll activate it. Mr. Thompson, I'll help you withdraw your money. The room grew deathly silent as Lisa finished inputting the commands. She paused for a moment, staring at the screen as if wrestling with herself one last time. A warning message popped up. Emergency protocol activated. Requires manager authorization. Lisa took a deep breath, her hands shaking, and pressed confirm. Walter stood still, his elderly eyes filled with anticipation, almost afraid to believe what was happening. The computer screen blinked, and the words, "Transaction approved," appeared. Lisa turned to him, her expression softer now, free from the rigid professionalism she had worn earlier. Mr. Thompson, your transaction is complete. Here is the money you need, she said gently, but with a newfound sense of responsibility. Walter accepted the envelope of cash, his trembling hands clutching it tightly as if it might disappear. He looked up at Lisa, tears streaming down his face, not of sorrow, but of relief and gratitude. Thank you. Thank you so much, he choked out, his voice breaking. You have no idea what this means to me and my wife. Shaq stood nearby, his lips curling into a warm, proud smile. He stepped closer to Lisa, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. You did the right thing, he said. You didn't just help Mr. Walter. You reminded all of us that compassion is far more important than any policy. Lisa lowered her head, a sense of relief washing over her like a weight being lifted. She didn't say anything, but her eyes met Walter's with a look full of empathy. The entire room seemed to brighten, as if her actions had not only changed one life, but reignited hope in the hearts of everyone watching. Shaq turned to Walter, crouching slightly so their eyes met, his expression sincere. Coach, today you didn't just receive help. You reminded us all that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can create the biggest changes. Walter clasped Shaq's hand tightly, a radiant smile breaking through his tear-streaked face. You're a remarkable man, Shaq. Not just for what you did for me today, but for how you use your strength and your heart to lift others up. Miara, standing beside them, couldn't hide her grin. She turned to Shaq, her eyes shining. Dad, today you were like a superhero. Shaq chuckled, bending down to tousle her hair. Not at all, sweetheart. The real superhero here is Mr. Walter. He showed us that sometimes all it takes is a little courage and kindness to change the world. Lisa watched as they walked away, Shaq's and Walter's reflections merging in the bank's glass doors, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. In her heart, something profound had shifted. She resolved that tomorrow would mark the start of changes in how the bank operated, so no one else would endure the injustice Walter had faced. Walter stepped out of the bank, clutching the envelope of money like a treasure. His eyes no longer carried the weight of despair, but shone with newfound hope. His wooden cane tapped rhythmically as he walked, but his posture was straighter now, as though the burden he'd carried for so long had finally been lifted. Shaq and Miara walked beside him in silence, quietly observing. When Walter stopped to wait for the bus, he turned to Shaq, his face glowing in the soft hues of twilight. "You've restored my faith in humanity," Walter said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. You've done more for me than I could ever ask for." Shaq crouched slightly again, taking Walter's frail hands in his own. "Coach, today you taught me a lesson. Life isn't just about what we achieve. It's about how we help others overcome their struggles. Use this money to take care of her. And if you ever need anything else, I'll always be here." Walter was at a loss for words. He simply squeezed Shaq's hand tightly, his eyes glistening. When the bus arrived, Shaq helped him step aboard, then stood watching as Walter's small figure disappeared into the glow of the setting sun. Miara gently tugged on Shaq's sleeve, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "Dad, we did something good today, didn't we?" Shaq smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulder. "We did, sweetheart. And remember, sometimes the best shots you'll ever make aren't on the court, they're in life." Inside the bank, Lisa stood silently behind the glass, her eyes following Shaq and Walter until they were out of sight. A faint smile appeared on her face, carrying with it a newfound resolve to ensure that no one else would ever feel as helpless as Walter had. She vowed to ensure that policies would no longer be walls separating people, but tools to serve compassion. The screen transitions to Shaq and Miara walking away under the warm glow of the setting sun, the bank fading into the background. A warm voice begins to narrate. This story isn't just about Mr. Walter or Shaq. It's a testament to the power of compassion, how even the smallest acts of kindness can change someone's life. The imagery shifts to Walter smiling as he receives the money, Lisa pressing the confirm button, and Shaq firmly shaking Walter's hand. We live in an increasingly modern world, but sometimes rigid policies make us forget what truly matters: empathy. Let's remember that behind every transaction and every rule are people with their own unique stories. Take the time to listen and understand them. Be the inspiration. If you found this story meaningful, share it and follow us to continue spreading the message of love and kindness.